Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. This is another in the series of episodes where we're sharing Tanner's onboarding journeys. We bring in our first account executive that's actually selling a Catalyst Sale product out in the marketplace. And I am happy to say that after a couple of weeks, Tanner is still with us. He has not exited the organization, nor has he been exited from the organization. So Tanner, welcome back.
Good to be back, Mike. I've survived to this point. That's good.
So what's been the worst thing that's happened so far?
This is obviously on record, so I'm going to not say anything about you, of course. The worst thing, I mean, all joking aside, the worst thing I think has been the adjustment into like an official sales role, where I think a lot of us were in sales roles without knowing we're in sales roles. But then you actually transition into like a quote official one, and you're like, man, I have no idea what I'm doing. When really we've been doing our whole life, you know. I think it was Jim Rohn who said that children are the best salespeople. They don't stop until they get what they want. Like we know what we're supposed to be doing, but then it's like we get in the real role and we're like, I don't know how to do this. Like this imposter syndrome almost comes over you. And so I think that's been the most challenging thing, is kind of breaking through this feeling of, well, what am I doing in this role? Like it's been an adjustment, but at the same time, it's been a good learning experience as well.
So how are you overcoming it?
A lot of it is studying and doing the homework on things, studying the frameworks, understanding why they work. And then also with that, going back through podcasts you've done or other interviews with other individuals to just constantly be learning. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've been taking away from everything, is just rather than try and be an expert, I'm just going to try and be a student. And that's actually been impactful since I started with everything I'm doing. Like, forget trying to be an expert in anything. I'll just be a student because I can learn more that way. I think I retain more that way. And it brings in a level of humility where you're still teachable. I think when you become an expert, it gets a little bit harder to teach you. So, that's how I've adjusted, is just saying I'm going to be a student through this process.
I think Barry Diller looks at this in a really, really cool way. He talks about it in the context of infinite learning. And in the past, I've talked about continuous learning, and a lot of people talk about continuous learning or always learning. Barry shared the idea of infinite learning on a podcast, Masters of Scale podcast. It was part of a 2-part series that Reid Hoffman's group did probably 2 years ago. But what Barry talked about in this idea of infinite learning is you're really looking at everything, every instance with a beginner's mind. And if we can come to each of those scenarios with a beginner's mind and a framework that we use to, 1, gather data, understand things, 2, start to assess that information. So we ask questions, we then think about those things. We then have other questions where we create some kind of hypothesis. Then we start testing against those things. Things start to work out for you. And it's just that continuous process over and over and over again. And for anybody who's been following me on Twitter, you see that I've picked up golf again, and I'm playing golf almost every day. And it's a great opportunity to get out with the kids. It is really hot here in Arizona. I'm actually walking the course as we do this. But the thing that at first couple of weeks of doing it, it was, hey, I want to just hit the ball hard and far and consistent. And now I'm back into more of a mode where through that initial functionally, do I know how to swing a golf club, and can I move through things, to how do I actually create a higher level of consistency? And for anybody who's played golf or has done anything where there's a motor skill activity, if you're thinking about it, you're not doing it very well. And, Tanner and I've talked about this before, I think on your podcast, where it was about, or maybe it was separately, but, quarterback mechanics. If you're a quarterback and you're thinking, all right, let me get my elbow up, my hand back, my hips through, you're getting sacked. Somebody's going to get you, or you're going to miss the window that you've got to throw through. So, as you go through this process, realize you're going to do some learning, you're going to do some practice, and then you just have to trust the process and let it flow through. So I think you're starting to get through that breakthrough now, Tanner, where as you go through this, you're saying, okay, now I can actually see why it's important to ask the question, what problem am I solving? Who cares about the problem? Why do they care about the problem? How have they attempted to solve it? How do we solve it that's different? When do they need to solve it by? And what's our actual plan of action to go in there and execute? And you're just seeing those things come together. Is that fair?
Yeah, and something that I've related it to when I was talking with my wife with it, because Mike, I've been fly fishing, man, for a long time. It's been like 18, 17 years that I've been fly fishing. And with fly fishing, first off, you have all kinds of flies, but then you have all kinds of reels, lines, tippets you can use, rod sizes, rod weights. And I'm like, that's kind of what Mike's put together here. Is he's put together this, if you're going on an epic fly fishing trip, he's giving you all the equipment. And now you have to go into these different scenarios and figure out what equipment's going to work in that area, with working with people, what tool, what framework, what method can help them the best to where I'm successful, but where they're also successful. And I think that's where I've seen other programs, not just sales specifically, other programs fall short is they tell you how you ought to operate, but then they leave you without any frameworks to do it once they're gone. And it's almost like a really poor crutch where with the Catalyst stuff, I can go back to the frameworks over and over and over again. It's just like I've had a number of outreaches I've put out there, and so far I've had one response. And if we hadn't had conversations and I hadn't gone through the frameworks, I'd be like, I don't know what's wrong here. But having a framework, I can go back and say, let's break this down and dissect this thing. Where am I falling short? Where am I not following the framework? Where is the process broken, or is there one that's not created yet, which has been super helpful. And being new in the role, it's been a huge stress relief to say I can just work my way backwards, just like I worked my way forward.
How many people have responded? So you said one response, and so the better question is, how many have you sent out? So how many have you sent out?
Around 30.
So, okay. So you've done outreach to between 25 and 30 people. You've got one response. So now we got to say, okay, why is this not working? Because my expectation would be we're going to get a response from 1 out of every 5 people that we send a communication to. We're going to get a 20% response rate. And others will argue there's no way you're going to get that high of a response rate. I'll argue that that's what I've seen historically. And whether or not we get into a detailed debate around that. It's more, okay, what comes next? So why might the outreach number be lower than what we would expect?
For me, I think the first thing would be, before we get into even the why, it's the humility to be ready to understand why it's not working, right? Because previous me a while ago would have been like, it's not my fault. It's got to be something else's fault. So I think that's the first part for me, is kind of saying, hey, I could be the problem in this situation. And a lot of it could be the communication and how I'm sending it or trying to interact with someone. When I look at the one interaction I had with the individual, what was really interesting, when we look at the territory plan and we have it set up with Catalyst, the kind of customers I should be looking for, clients, right? And this person fit it to a T, even to the point where it was almost like kind of a gift, where on their LinkedIn thing, they had put it open for business, but they've been open for 2 years. And I was like, this person clearly is trying to get someone's attention. And so I was able to reach out to him and say, hey, I saw your post. How are things going? If you got more traction after you're doing that. And it turned into a really good conversation. And that was a big thing for me, of like, okay, conversations will work, recognizing they need help will work. I think where the challenges has come in for me a little bit is where some people aren't as vulnerable in needing the help. And that's, for me, has been a little bit of a challenge. Being new in the role, it's harder for me to recognize the red flags of people asking for help, because I've noticed there's a big lack of vulnerability. There's a couple lists you sent me over to work through where people have given feedback that they have sales struggles, but then you go to their LinkedIn or other things, and they're sales experts and they're crushing it. And I'm like, well, are you crushing it or are you struggling? And I don't know how to help you now. And I think that's a really interesting thing to see these people saying, I'm a sales expert, but then secretly they're like, man, I really need some help here. Like, things are stagnant.
Yeah. Well, and everybody needs help. Like we can all get better in this continuous learning process. We can all get better. And if we're not getting better, then you're falling backwards. And you're either moving forward or you're coasting. And if you're coasting, most of the time you're losing momentum or you're going downhill. And neither of those are really, really good things. So that authenticity is important. The challenge is, especially in a role where you're a sales professional, you usually have to present this idea, this persona of, I know these things. There's this idea of I've got to be the alpha in the room. And I think we all can do a better job realizing that we learn from others and we get smarter together. When we get into that outreach piece, and at some point, I know you had asked that question on Twitter, and I want to do a separate episode where we get into why that's a challenge that's out there, why we might not want to be vulnerable. But as you go through outreach, and you say, I've sent this stuff out to 30 people and I'm not getting the response that I expect. Well, then the next question is, well, are they the right people? So do we have a problem with our ideal customer profile? Because we could have a problem with our ideal customer profile. We might need to move up market. We might need to move to the side. We might need to do something different. It could be a problem at the org level, or it could be the problem at an individual level. So one is, do we have a problem with our ideal customer profile? And we can test that by testing other ideal customer profiles. The other challenge could be, maybe there's a challenge in the communication. Maybe the message that we're sending is not very clear. Maybe they're looking at it, they're seeing the message and like, dude, I see you coming from a mile away. You're going to sneak in, ask like you're going to help me. And then you're going to try to sell me something. And I'm not the easy prey that's out there waiting to be sold to, and nobody wants to be sold to. And it's funny, we don't want to be sold to, but we like buying things. We buy things because we like solving problems. If we can build up a level of trust and rapport and believe that people are going to help us solve those problems, then the likelihood that we're going to move forward with some kind of a transaction or some kind of interaction or some kind of a relationship starts to increase. So we talked about some of those tests. The next thing we talked about, and the intention of this conversation, is to share with everybody, what does the onboarding process look like? How do you help someone who's new to sales actually start performing? And there's some people who are going to be listening to this and they're going to say, this is pretty remedial stuff. It's all basic. I would challenge you, look at the work that you're doing. Are you even doing the basic stuff? And I can tell you over and over again that that's where most of us fall short. We think we're doing the basic stuff, but we don't. And if you're doing the basic stuff and it's still not working, then you've got to figure out something else might be wrong. But the next thing we started talking about, Tanner, was the idea of, hey, it's not just one communication. There's a sequence of communication that we've got to deliver. Because if we just send them one, then they kind of feel like, hey, you're just kind of testing. It's like when you're fly fishing and the fish comes up and it just nibbles a little bit, like, hey, they're just testing things out to see if they like what's there. And if, where do they go? Like, what happens next? And what do you need to do to entice them or demonstrate a level of engagement that, hey, you can believe this lure that's shiny and in front of you and it's interesting. So what does the next set of sequences look like? Or how are you thinking about what's next with some of these people that you reach out to that you've not heard anything from? And maybe you didn't hear something from them because they've got 35,000 unread emails like we just went through a look at, or maybe they just missed it or they didn't understand or whatever. So what's next in your mind?
Yeah, in our conversation we had, you brought up there's, these sequences where you'll have that initial outreach and in hopes of, a conversation, but then you bring value. And I think one of the things that's been most rewarding for me is when I'm having these contacts with people or when I'm sending it out and I see they have a problem. And some of them have given specific feedback where I'll say, hey, through feedback I've seen, you have said you're struggling with, X, Y, and Z. Here's actually a couple podcast episodes with all the show notes that you can look at, and there's some tools there. So hopefully you'll find this helpful. If you have any questions, please let me. And that's been rewarding because I'm like, man, you know this about me. Like, everything changed for me when I started listening to podcasts, and I found a bunch of really amazing people. And that's when light bulbs started going off. And so to be able to turn around and then help other individuals with really strong content, but then also content that I've practiced. I mean, with the Catalyst stuff, Catalyst sales stuff, that I've applied it in a lot of unique ways in my life for the past year, and some very unconventional ways that have proven extremely effective, right? And so for me, it's rewarding to be able to share that with them. And I think that's kind of where going back to the beginning of the conversation, that just kind of that confidence of moving forward of like, hey, I know this actually works. Like, you just got to just communicate with me and we can get to a really cool place. And I think also getting past that wall of like, it's, I don't know if it's kind of like the what about Bob thing when he talks about the phone not working and he's like, people are like that sometimes. You just got to hang up and try again later. And I think that's what reminded me about our conversation was just, hey, the phone might not have been working. Just try again. Just keep trying until something, right?
Well, and we talked as well about like communication with me. So, if you send an email to me, the likelihood that I'm going to read it is pretty low. Like stuff just disappears. So the best way to get a hold of me is Slack or text message. And either you've got the ability to do either of those. The other way that I've shared with others is you can send me a direct message on Twitter. You can send a direct message to Catalyst Sale. You can send a direct message to me on Twitter. And I will see those direct messages faster than I will see my email. Yet I get just hammered with sales emails and spam outreach on both LinkedIn and email. I've been public about how to communicate with me, yet do you know the number of times that I've received a sales oriented communication via Twitter direct message? Zero.
I'm just gonna
Zero.
guess. I was gonna say
It hasn't.
zero. Yeah.
It hasn't happened. Well, and you don't have to guess because I told you earlier. But like,
I know, but still.
there's zero. It just does. It's So you've got to get into that mode where you say, I want to meet people where they are. I want to use other mediums. So beyond the messaging sequence, the ideal customer profile, and the tone of the message, you then start to look at what's the medium. So what is the communication? How is it delivered? And there's a number of different ways that we can go through this. So that'll be the next set of tests. And it'll be interesting as we revisit this in a couple of weeks, how things change, because we're going to continue to test different things in the marketplace. The other question that came up when we were talking earlier was around, do you apply call planning in the context of outreach to folks? And I thought it was a really interesting question because a lot of the concepts are the same. Like we talk about it in call planning. It's who's going to be in the room, what are their objectives, what are our objectives, what are our desired next steps. And really the only time that I want to put together a call plan is if I'm going to have a call, if I'm actually going to have a meeting with somebody, I've got something scheduled. Yet the same concepts apply in the outreach that we send out, or this structurally, because we've got this idea of, and this is where you get into things like sales rep approach. We identify people. So now we know who. We engage with people, what we send, how, right? We then have a set of desired next steps, like things that we want to accomplish, objectives, desired next steps. And we call them the action and the communication. So I can see how both of them pull together, but the key here is let's not overthink about the process and get sidetracked and say, I've got to document out this perfect call plan just to do an email. Because if you do that, you're going to find yourself constantly going through the process of call planning rather than actually doing work and engaging with others. So I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective when you ask the question. You're saying, hey, these look like they're the same functionally because they're foundational items. They are definitely related, same kind of questions, but the way the tool applies is a bit different.
Yeah. And I think too with that, I think it goes back to just being able to ask questions, right? And wanting to learn. Like as I'm going through, there's so much, I guess this is a tease to make people want to buy this. There's so much stuff in here that's valuable, but it all connects. It's all in unison. It's all in harmony. And all these tools just build on top of each other, right? For me to be able to look at the territory plan and say, all right, I know who my ideal customer is today. To be able to say, all right, I know how I'm going to reach out to them. I know how to identify. I know how to shape the messaging. It's taken a lot of the, overabundance of brain power to get something done. And you can actually think rather than muddle through a bunch of thoughts. You actually can think very clearly of here's what I need to be doing. And I think there's a big difference there between running everywhere in your brain and thinking of just, this is the thing. I'm going to get clarity on it. I'm going to focus on it. And then, there's the execution part of it.
And sales is a thinking process. So you go through this and you say, if I compare this to my checklist of things that I'm working through, I can really start to figure out, is the reason my golf swing is all over the place, is it because I'm thinking about too many things, or because I didn't do my basic stuff, which is my grip right? Am I aligned properly? Do I have the right tool in my hand? Am I just letting things go? And am I just swinging through? So Tanner, this has been awesome, and I look forward to continuing these discussions around this and sharing with folks. In the spirit of authenticity and transparency, you asked me a question, I think last week. You're like, "Hey, how do I know whether or not I'm doing the how am I going to be? How do I measure success from an activity perspective?" And I put up a Franklin T on the whiteboard. What did I put on either side of the Franklin T?
I'll let you share, Mike. You put it in such a kind way.
Said profit and loss. And then I put a stick figure up there. And the stick figure was you. And I put you on one side of the Franklin T. And right now you're in the loss side of the column. As we start selling things, you'll move into the profit side of the column. And that's really how we measure success. I mean, we're sales professionals. We look at this and we say, there's a couple of things we can do. We can generate revenue to support continuing to build the business, which is one thing. And that's a big challenge that organizations have. Beyond the generating revenue, we can gather data, we can gather intelligence, we can start to determine whether or not the things we're doing is working. So we test. We use the testing to provide feedback into the organization to say, here are other tests that we want to apply. And then after we start to see performance, then we figure out of those things, what can we start to automate to accelerate growth? So although that was harsh to put Franklin T up there and put Tanner on the loss side of the column, I think it's us just kind of going back to the basics and saying, hey, look, here's how we actually measure success. Are we generating revenue? Are we making an impact or not? If we're not, then what value are we delivering to the organization? If we can't define that value, then we've got to ask ourselves, are we in the right place? Are we doing the right thing? Or do we need to move forward and do something different? So Tanner, thanks for being comfortable with the level of directness and transparency and authenticity.
Of course, Mike. It's always a joy. One thing I'd say, to going back to that idea of the measurements really quick is, talking about fishing, you never hear a fisherman say, I had X amount of casts today. It's always, how many fish did I catch? And after we had that conversation, I'm like, oh, I get where he's coming from. He doesn't care about the cast. He cares about the fish. That makes sense. And it's just, and I think authenticity in relationships is major where, the approachability I have with you, or I can just ask you a question and not feel silly about it. I think that's another part of it. And also in asking questions, after going through a lot of this framework, using these tools for as long as I have, having a friendship with you, the ability to ask better questions has also been a gift and skill that has been awarded or achieved. I don't know which one it would be. Both, maybe.
I have nothing to add. You just said that I'm a gift and I have skills. So Tanner, as usual, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale podcast. If you know of anybody who would benefit from this conversation or this discussion, please share it. If you have questions that you'd like us to address or me to address, Simmons_M on Twitter or at Catalyst Sale is a great place to find me. If you have questions that you'd like Tanner or I to discuss as we go through the onboarding process and sharing, please let us know that. And if you're interested in Catalyst Sale, please send us a note. Thank you.